What is happening in Washington right now? It is not just a trade war. We have moved past that. What we are witnessing tonight is an institutional war. It is a direct, high-stakes collision between the President of the United States and the United States Supreme Court. And it is happening at a speed that should make your head spin. Think about the timeline here. Less than 24 hours ago, the Supreme Court, the Supremes, issued a major ruling. They struck down the president's use of IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to impose global tariffs. It was a massive legal setback. For a moment, the guardrails seemed to have held. The court said no. And in normal politics, that is where you pause. That is where you regroup. But we are not in normal politics. Today, via a statement on Truth Social, the president didn't just respond to the court, he didn't just express disappointment, he dropped the hammer. He announced that effective immediately, he is raising his new global tariff to 15%. You have to look at the sequence to understand the defiance. Yesterday, after the ruling, he hiked tariffs to 10% as a stopgap. Today, he moved the needle to 15%. That is the absolute maximum allowed under a completely separate trade law. He didn't just ignore the court's ruling, he ran around it. He found a different door and he kicked it open. And the language he used to describe the third branch of government, it was not diplomatic. He slammed the Supreme Court decision as ridiculous, poorly written, and, most importantly, extraordinarily anti-American. This is the President of the United States calling a final ruling of the Supreme Court anti-American while simultaneously announcing a policy that effectively renders their decision moot. But here's the thing. How does he do this? How does he raise the tariff to 15% the day after the court told him his previous method was illegal? The answer lies in a specific 50-year-old piece of legislation that most of Washington had forgotten about, a piece of law that the president is now using as a shield. And, as we're going to see in Part 2, the math behind this move means that for many countries, the victory they thought they won in court yesterday just turned into a much more expensive reality today. But here is the thing. How does a president, just hours after a stinging rebuke from the highest court in the land, find a way to not only restore those tariffs, but actually increase them? He does it by reaching into the back of the legal archive and pulling out a tool that hasn't been touched in decades. It's called Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. Think of Section 122 as a break glass in case of emergency button for trade. It was designed back in the early 70s in the shadow of the Nixon shock, specifically to give the president a fast, blunt instrument to deal with what the law calls large and serious balance of payments deficits. And here is why this is the president's new favorite law. 1, it doesn't require a long, boring investigation. 2, it doesn't require a months-long study by the Commerce Department. 3, it allows the president to act unilaterally for 150 days without needing a single vote from Congress. And this is where the irony gets almost painful for those who were celebrating yesterday's Supreme Court ruling. For some countries, the president's move today to 15% is actually higher than the rates they were paying under the old, now illegal IEEPA tariffs. The court said the president couldn't use the emergency law to liberate the economy. So the president used the payments law to tax it even harder. It's a 15% baseline tariff applied globally, effective immediately. The president was very careful to note in his statement that this authority has been legally tested. He's referring to the Nixon era, when similar moves were challenged and upheld, because the law, unlike IEEPA, specifically grants the power to impose surcharges. But here is the catch. Section 122 comes with a ticking clock. It's a 150-day free pass. After that, the president has to go to Congress. He has to ask for an extension. And that is where the math gets messy. Because while the president is slamming the court as anti-American, the coalition he needs to keep these tariffs alive for more than 5 months is already starting to show signs of stress. There are Democrats who hate the policy, and there are Republicans who are staring at the economic data for their home states and starting to sweat. The president just bought himself 150 days of defiance. But as we move into part 3, we have to look at the other tools he's preparing, the investigations, the probes, and the way he is setting up a multi-front legal war to ensure that even if one door stays locked, he has 10 more keys. But that's the thing. You have to ask yourself, if the president knows that Section 122 only gives him a 150-day window, what is his plan for day 151? What happens when that clock runs out and he has to face a potentially hostile Congress to get an extension? Well, if you think he's just crossing his fingers and hoping for the best, you haven't been paying attention. Because the president isn't just pushing one button, he is launching a multi-front legal offensive designed to make sure the trade war doesn't just survive, it accelerates. Think of these 150 days of 15% global tariffs as a bridge. It's a temporary structure designed to keep the pressure at maximum while his team builds something much more permanent in the background. The administration has signaled that they are now moving to activate Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. Now, Section 301 is a different kind of weapon. Unlike the blunt global hammer of Section 122, Section 301 is a scalpel. It allows the president to investigate individual countries, analyze their specific trade practices, and then, if he decides they are ripping us off, impose tariffs tailored specifically to them. But here's the catch. Section 301 investigations take time. They take research. They take months of preparation to be legally tested and ready for a courtroom fight. And that is exactly why today's 15% global hike is so significant. By invoking Section 122 immediately, the president has effectively paused the world. He has ensured that every single country, regardless of whether they've made concessions, regardless of whether they have a fair trade balance, will face that 15% rate starting right now. He's not waiting for the investigations to finish. He's taxing everyone first and asking questions later. The president even dropped the hammer on his critics, noting that while the left will presumably sue to halt these tariffs too, he is confident because these specific laws have been tested in court previously. He is essentially saying to the Supreme Court, "You took away my emergency powers? Fine, I'll use my trade laws. You want to stop me? See you in 5 months." But as the president signals he's making America great again, greater than ever before, the reality on the ground is shifting because a 15% tariff on everything from everywhere doesn't just impact foreign capitals, it impacts your grocery store, it impacts your local car dealership. And as we move into part 4, we're going to look at the thorough, detailed, and complete review the president claimed to have done and why the math of a 15% global baseline is about to send shockwaves through a global economy that thought the Supreme Court had just saved it. But it doesn't just stop at the legal maneuvering in the West Wing or the angry posts on Truth Social. We have to look at what this actually does to the world, and more importantly, what it does to you. Because while Section 122 and Section 301 sound like dry, dusty pieces of legislative paper, in reality, they are a 15% surcharge on your life. The president said today that his decision was based on a thorough, detailed, and complete review. But look at the result of that review. It is a blanket. At least for the next 150 days, Exports from every country on Earth will now face a 15% tariff rate. It doesn't matter if they are a strategic ally. It doesn't matter if they have spent the last year making massive concessions to the White House. It doesn't matter if they have fair trade practices. The baseline has moved. 15% on everything, from everywhere, all at once. The president's justification for this isn't found in a spreadsheet. It's found in a word he uses over and over: retribution. He argued that these countries have been ripping the U.S. off for decades, and he is the first one to stop it. He is framing this 15% tax not as a trade policy, but as a long overdue invoice. He is essentially telling the world, I don't care what the Supreme Court says. I don't care what your trade agreements say. You owe us, and I'm collecting now. And here is the kicker, the deep irony of this moment. For many countries, the victory they thought they won in court yesterday has now become a nightmare, because the 15% rate he just announced is actually higher than the specific rates that applied to them under the previous law. They sued to stop the 10% rate, the court agreed, and the president responded by hitting them with 15%. It's the ultimate be careful what you wish for scenario in international law. But even as the president declares that this will make America greater than ever before, he's running headfirst into a political reality he cannot ignore. Because while he has the power to do this for 150 days, the clock is ticking. We're going to look at the opposing forces, the Democrats and the specific bloc of Republicans who are now realizing that a global 15% tax on everything might be a political death sentence for their own constituents. But here is the thing: 150 days. In the world of global trade, in the world of complex supply chains, manufacturing contracts, and international shipping, 150 days is the blink of an eye. It's barely enough time for one container ship to make a few round trips across the Pacific. And that is the critical detail here. While the president is celebrating what he calls a thorough, detailed, and complete review, and while he is taking a victory lap on Truth Social for outmaneuvering the Supreme Court, he has essentially put himself on a timer. You see, Section 122 was never intended to be a permanent grant of power. It was designed with a leash. The 1974 Trade Act says the president can do this for exactly 5 months, and then the authority expires. To keep that 15% global tax alive on day 151, he doesn't just need a social media post. He doesn't just need a legally tested theory. He needs a vote. He needs the United States Congress to step in and grant him an extension. And that is where the strategy hits a very real, very solid political wall. Because securing that approval, it's not a given. We're already seeing the lines being drawn. It's not just the Democrats who are lining up to oppose this. That's expected. It is the members of his own party. It is the Republicans in states that rely on exports, the Republicans who represent farmers, the Republicans who are hearing from local businesses that a 15% hike on every raw material is going to bankrupt them before the summer is over. The president even acknowledged this tension in his statement. He noted that the left will likely sue to halt these tariffs too. He's practically daring them to do it. He's counting on the fact that this specific law has been upheld before, giving him a legal shield while he tries to win the political war. He is essentially saying to his opponents, I have 5 months of absolute authority. I am going to use every second of it to reshape the world, and I'm betting you won't have the stomach to stop me when the clock runs out. But what happens if the clock does run out? What happens if Congress says no? The administration has already hinted at their backup plan: the investigations, the individual probes, the multi-front legal war we discussed. They are preparing for a scenario where the global tariff might fail, but the targeted tariffs take its place. We're going to look at the Make America Great and Greater Than Ever Before endgame. We're going to look at what this defiance means for the future of the Supreme Court's authority, and whether this 150-day bridge is a path to a new economy or a road to a massive institutional crash. So let's take a step back and look at the architecture of what the president just did over the last 48 hours. Because it is a masterclass in what we call lane-switching governance. The Supreme Court, the final arbiter of law in this country, spent months reviewing his previous tariff policy. They looked at the emergency law he used, they looked at the Constitution, and they said, no, you cannot do it this way. They closed that lane. And in any other era, in any other presidency, that would be the end of the story. You might get a disappointed press release, but the policy would stop. But this president, he didn't just ignore the no. He didn't even wait for the ink to dry on the court's ruling. Within 24 hours, he found a different lane. He found an obscure 1974 trade law, he slammed the court as anti-American, and he didn't just restore the tariffs, he hiked them to the absolute legal maximum. 15%. Global, immediate. The president's endgame, as he put it in his own words, is making America great again, greater than ever before. But to get there, he is testing a theory of power that is profoundly unsettling to the institutional guardrails of this country. He is testing whether a president can effectively nullify a Supreme Court ruling simply by switching legal justifications faster than the courts can keep up. If the left sues to stop Section 122, as the president assumes they will, it will take months, perhaps years, to reach a final decision. And in the meantime, the 15% tariff stays. The money gets collected, the retribution is achieved. That is the greater than ever reality we are looking at tonight. It is a world where the rulings of the Supreme Court are treated not as binding commands, but as temporary hurdles to be jumped. If a president can be rebuked by the highest court in the land on a Tuesday and then implement an even more aggressive version of that same policy on a Wednesday using a different piece of paper, then we have to ask ourselves, what is the actual weight of a Supreme Court ruling? Is the court's authority absolute, or is it merely advisory until the president finds a workaround? The 150-day clock is now ticking. For the next 5 months, the president has his bridge. He has his 15% global tax. He has his defiance. But as that clock winds down, he is going to have to face the very institutions he is currently mocking. He will need a Congress that is currently fracturing, and he will eventually face a judiciary that does not take kindly to being called anti-American. This 150-day bridge is either the start of a new, unchecked era of executive trade power, or it is the path to a massive institutional crash. We are watching the architecture of American power bend in real time. The question is no longer just about the price of goods. It's about who actually holds the final word in this democracy. The president says he's making America great again. The court says he's breaking the law. And for at least the next 150 days, the president is betting that in a fight between a legal ruling and a Truth Social post, the Post wins.